What really surprised me is that I thought, we're just the students, they're going to have us do this sort of like introductory level work. But then I learned that actually the PhD students and the most brilliant minds in the world, for them to execute experiments, they're actually pretty much doing the same manual labor, which is, in my opinion, a huge loss for science, is to have all these people pipetting. It's kind of like the architects having to build their own buildings. They're not going to be as productive.
Welcome to Discovery Engines, a podcast on the people and the platforms who are accelerating scientific discovery. I'm your host, Nabil Laoudji. When you see an ad run by a large biotech or pharma organization on TV, often you'll see some really cool, slick machinery. This machinery is often really taking small amounts of liquid and moving them around in the scientific process that's required to come up with, say, a new drug or therapeutic. The companies that have built these machines have built incredible instruments that are doing amazing work in accelerating science R&D. And these machines don't come cheap. They also often require deep technical expertise that is tied to that particular vendor's tech stack. This can make it difficult to mix and match systems, and it can also make it challenging for a cash-strapped startup or a student entrepreneur to, say, take a bunch of used lab equipment and do interesting science with it in ways that you might be able to do with other technologies, such as in software with coding. Well, in today's episode, I'm excited to sit down with Rick Wierenga, creator of PyLabRobot, an open source Python software development kit for lab automation. Rick and a growing number of contributors are tackling the barriers to lab automation head on. A journey that, for Rick, started with an insight that he gained while taking a college biology class, and that took a big leap forward after he sent a cold email while visiting MIT. For Rick's story, and a look into the growing movement to make lab automation more accessible and universal, join me for today's conversation. Let's go. Rick, welcome to Discovery Engines.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So when I talk to people about accelerating science through lab automation, they're really excited about the prospect of lab automation, but then they also quickly mention the pain points. If I am trying to program a bunch of different instruments or work with a bunch of different instruments, they have a lot of different proprietary languages and protocols. If I have a science protocol that I've developed in a lab and I'm trying to share it with another lab that has a different set of instruments, there are some headaches involved there. And so it ends up becoming a point of friction with regards to really being able to lean into lab automation. And so one reason I'm really excited to chat with you is that you have tackled this question and this challenge head on as the creator of PyLabRobot, which is, and I'll get this right, a open source hardware-agnostic interface for liquid handling robots and accessories, at least per the definition, I think, on the Github. And so I'm really looking forward to learning more about PyLabRobot and just your perspective on democratizing lab innovation or lab automation.
Cool. Yeah, happy to chat.
Awesome. Great. Well, let's get started with your background. So you are the creator of PyLabRobot. You are currently a programmer at RetroBio. Before that, you got your Bachelor's of Science in AI and Bioinformatics at Leiden University in Holland. Fun fact, per Wikipedia, the oldest institution, university in Holland since 1575, produced 16 Nobel laureates, so really impressive. And then you were one of the winners in the 2019 Google Codin open source software development competition. Am I getting this right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, cool. So when we chatted before this interview, you shared a really fun story about how you initially got connected with MIT and essentially this project sort of germinated. And it happened through a trip to Boston. So could you maybe share that story with us?
Yeah, for sure. So the story starts all the way back in high school, where I was going to school back in Holland. And I was sort of like teaching myself programming sort of after school during the nights because there's not really like so much CS education in school, but I find it really interesting. And then one day I thought it would be a good reason or a good idea for me to actually start participating in programming competitions. I'm not sure why. I had no idea of winning or doing well in them, but I thought maybe it's like a fun project, so why not take a chance? And then actually I was lucky enough to to win one of those competitions. At first it was the WWDC, where we got actually a trip to Silicon Valley to attend WWDC, which is Apple's annual developers conference. And then after that, I also participated in Google's coding competition, which is this open source sort of competition where you work on an open source project for 2 months. And then after that, they make a recommendation of people who they thought did well. So I worked on TensorFlow for 2 months. And then they thought that I did well. So we were promised another trip to Silicon Valley. But this was unfortunately during the pandemic, so the trip got canceled. But they did end up giving us a lot of money instead. So that was nice. And then so this other guy who also won with the same organization, open source organization that I did, we decided why not organize our own trip. And he was doing this internship at MIT at that time, so I was like, why not? Why not I come visit you there? And we were really curious, like, what is going on at this university? So we just actually cold emailed a bunch of professors, like, can we just like see your lab on the inside? Like, can we learn what's going on? And so actually one of the people who got back to me was Dana, who is the creator of PyHamilton. And at that time I was kind of thinking about this sort of like AWS for biology and programming biology with Python. And so seeing his project actually exist in real life, that was super exciting to me. I had no idea that people were actually working on sort of automating wet lab biology. And so that was super exciting, and kept in touch with him and sort of went from there.
Wow. What gave you the idea, or I would say the courage to just cold email a bunch of professors on a trip to Boston?
I guess as a 19-year-old, I did not really have better ideas. I thought, why not ask? Sort of the Dutch spirit of being direct, and just we have the saying that if you don't shoot, it's always a miss. So better take your shot.
Wow. Okay. So a couple of coding competitions, and then also this emerging interest in kind of AWS for biology. Where did that interest come from?
So I think this is, so this trip was during my freshman year of college, where I actually took my first actual wet lab biology class, first time holding a pipette. And then the teacher made us do this really interesting experiment where we did this protein activity assay. And then at the end of the class, she had us share our results for this project. And it was interesting to me that the results in our group, they differed by actually an order of magnitude between different people who did the experiment, which, granted we were like this, 18, 19-year-old students, kind of hungover sometimes. So maybe not as good as real biologists, but still an order of magnitude is quite a significant difference. And sort of coming a little bit from computing, that kind of surprised me. Because if you do the same thing you expect to have the same result. And also I sort of developed some experience programming on my own. And so you can imagine that when I came into the wet lab and had to do all this manual labor, and then you make a mistake and you have to start from scratch and there's no source control, so you cannot go back and you cannot copy paste. It was a little bit agitating to me actually, to be frank. And so I thought, what if you could program this like I program my computer? And then sort of philosophizing mostly about this without a real idea that people are actually working on this kind of stuff. And so you can imagine when I saw data and actually working on this stuff, that was super exciting to me.
That's really interesting. So in a way, what I'm hearing is you brought your sort of coding and software development sensibilities to biology and thought, how is it that we're all following a similar process and getting such different outcomes? And wow, in order to fix this, you can't just copy paste as you might be able to. So maybe there's a different approach here.
Exactly. And then what really surprised me is that I thought, we're just the students, they're going to have us do this sort of introductory level work. But then I learned that actually the PhD students and the most brilliant minds in the world, for them to execute experiments, they're actually pretty much doing the same manual labor, which is, in my opinion, a huge loss for science, is to have all these people pipetting. It's kind of like the architects having to build their own buildings. They're not going to be as productive.
So you sent an email or a bunch of emails, one of which was, you mentioned, I think, Dana, who was involved with PyLab or PyHamilton. Mm-hmm. Maybe could you share more about what is, for folks who maybe aren't even familiar with the equipment, what is Hamilton, or what is a Hamilton, and what was Dana's involvement with that project?
So Hamilton, when people refer to a Hamilton, they mostly refer to a liquid handling robot, which is essentially a pipetting robot. And then pipetting, maybe for people who don't know, is essentially a way of moving small amounts of liquid around, which is sort of the core operation of wet lab biology research. Hamilton was originally, I think, like this syringe company, and then they sort of moved on to liquid handlers. So that's why you say Hamilton. That's kind of the industry standard for this kind of automation nowadays. And so with Hamilton, the way that they're typically programmed is through this program that's called Venus. Or actually, it's a set of programs, which it looks a little bit complicated. There's a bunch of buttons, it's actually a bunch of different programs that together form Venus, which can make it difficult sometimes to have, for example, interactive and closed-loop systems that you program for these robots. And so Dana, together with Erica and Emma, who are PhD students and postdocs in the lab at that time, in the SFAL lab, he started working on a way of actually using programming to interface with Hamilton robots. And so Hamilton essentially is a Python interface to Venus, and then Venus is going to talk to the machines.
Okay, that's great. So maybe just for folks who haven't spent time in a lab, you walk in, maybe the exposure that they might have are through commercials for big pharma companies or biotech companies like Genentech, and they see all of these fancy machines whirring and buzzing. But when we walk into a lab and we see a bunch of liquid handlers and other types and shakers and other types of machines, like what is the typical sort of like stack of like hardware and software, right? So maybe like at the base, if we start with just the hardware itself, right? There might be a liquid handler. Imagining there's some sort of firmware or software that is running on that thing, right? I then hear things about like, lab orchestration software, there's lab information management systems, LIMS and so forth. So could you maybe give us like a generic version of the stack, and then we can talk about where sort of PyLabRobot fits into that?
For sure.
Okay.
So with lab automation, there's not a single robot that can do everything. It's kind of like for every individual task, you kind of mostly need a new type of robot. You can maybe compare this to cooking, where you have like a boiler and maybe a cutter and something that moves around and something that shakes a little bit. And in lab automation, each of these has its own machine. And oftentimes actually has its own software too. So if you have the shaker or like a tilting module, even though all of them, no matter who manufactures them, kind of do the same thing, you're going to need different software to talk to them. And sometimes even different computers, because sometimes these machines, the software is so difficult to install that manufacturers rather ship you a computer with it. So you can imagine in a lab where you have a bunch of different machines and a bunch of different computers, how you're going to get them to talk together. This has been a question, I think, for a couple of years, and so people have obviously been trying to solve this. And so that is where sort of these integrator companies come in, where they ship you maybe yet another computer that then connects to the computers you already have, so that you can talk to the machines and get them to work together and sort of orchestrate workflows that touch upon multiple kinds of machines. And then for a lot of data is produced in automation. That is, one of the primary uses is to do things at high scale, and then that kind of feeds into like LIMS, like lab information systems, etc.
Wow, that almost feels like one of those like science cartoons of in order to control these computers, let me ship you one more computer.
One more computer.
That's right.
Yeah, one more computer will fix it.
One more computer will fix it. Okay. Prior to PyLabRobot, when folks wanted to orchestrate a bunch of different hardware and so forth, you mentioned that kind of the default solution was having all of these computers and needing to interface to maybe different sets of robots through different types of computers, maybe operating systems and so forth. I guess, what does it look like when you have a system like PyLabRobot in place? How does that look different today?
Yeah, so with PyLabRobot, one of the key features is that you can just use one computer and that is going to talk to all the different devices. In PyLabRobot, every device is kind of compatible with any operating system, because we really sort of bypass all OEM software. We just talk directly to the machine. So that means that you can use your MacBook, for example, to talk to a Hamilton Star or any of the other machines, or a Raspberry Pi, or just kind of any computer that you want is compatible with any machine that you want. And this allows you to have all these kind of interfaces in just one script that you can use to interface with all of them. And then all of the cables just go into one computer. And so.
Got it. And maybe just earlier when you talked about different computers needed for different machines, I mean, are we talking about the requirement, like there are apps, for example, that only run on Windows versus others that only run on Mac versus Linux versus others, or is there something else that kind of necessitated the sort of like bifurcation of systems?
Yeah, so in some cases it's different operating systems where programs are compatible with, mostly it's just Windows, but maybe different versions of Windows. But then also sometimes the software just comes with the computer and the license key or whatever is kind of locked to that specific computer. So that maybe requires you to have multiple computers running at the same time.
Got it. Okay, that's helpful context. Good. So maybe then talking about sort of the community of folks that are building PyLabRobot. So I was looking at sort of the GitHub, and I see this, the repository has 1,450 commits as of, I guess, a few days ago, 238 stars, 86 forks, 32 different contributors on the program, on the project. Can you maybe describe the community right now that's building PyLabRobot?
Yeah, for sure. And by the way, I think it's going to be more commits because we make commits literally every single day. But yeah, the community, it's mostly people. We all work for different kind of companies where our jobs is to ship science in the end, just to do scientific experiments. And that is really the case for every individual contributor, where we need to do an experiment, and then the only way really to do that is to write your own software and kind of use PyLabRobot just for various reasons. And so it's really like sort of this community who's trying to do things, and then they're building what they need to get that work done. And in particular, there is a person called Camilo who's one of the most productive contributors to the project. Yeah, he's fantastic.
Shout out to them. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So what kind of, are these folks who are also working in industry? Are they in academia? Is it kind of hobby projects for folks who are interested like you about how can we create the AWS of biology? What are their backgrounds?
Mostly I would say it's industry people. There are some different startups. There's also actually a very big pharma company that recently reached out about using it potentially, and also some academic labs. And I think for Camilo and me, it's also a hobby to kind of work on this in our own time.
And what do you think is for example, why would a large, pharma company have an incentive to embrace this? I mean, could you maybe share what you think is driving them from their perspective?
For sure. So I think for these companies, in the end of the day, they're not really interested in building automation software or building automation systems in the first place. I think it's sort of like a necessary thing for them to do this, and that's why they're interested in it. And then I think with PyLabRobot, since it has very fast development, it's very nice tools, it kind of provides this universal interface to a bunch of these machines. It just allows people to do their work faster, essentially. And so you can also imagine for these companies, why don't they just hire their own people to write their own software internally? Certainly some of the big pharma companies, they have so much money, why don't they just build something themselves? And so you can kind of wonder about this. But I think for these companies, since writing these automation interfaces, it's quite a lot of work because there's a lot of different configurations, there are a lot of different edge cases and a lot of different things that you can do. And so doing all of that yourself, it takes a long time, it's very resource intensive. Some problems only occur one time in 1,000, so you really have to do a lot of work to get it to be robust. And so there's a lot of value in collaborating with other people who are sort of thinking about the same kinds of problems and solving the same kinds of problems. And then collaborating with them. So you have really this community of people who are solving the problems and making them more robust and working together, which is certainly a lot better than having your own internal tool, which you're like the only person in the whole world that uses it. If the rest of the world is going to move on with something newer, you probably want to be part of that. You want to be on that train.
Is there another open source project that you take inspiration from that you think has had a similar impact in industry?
Definitely. For me, the project I really look up to is PyTorch. Essentially, that's also a little bit my ambitious goal for PyLabRobot is to become like the PyTorch of lab automation, to do for the lab automation community what PyTorch has done for the machine learning community. So just to maybe I guess kind of explain what is PyTorch.
Sure.
So PyTorch is this library that is used for writing neural networks and kind of interfacing with different kinds of GPUs and training neural networks. And everyone who is using machine learning nowadays, they're using PyTorch, whether it is like Facebook training these huge large language models, or me as a teenager in my bedroom, I was using PyTorch for some very simple experiments. And also for end users, they are using PyTorch indirectly, maybe if they're not using it directly. When they talk to chat, maybe there's some PyTorch code that runs on a server somewhere. And I think there's a reason for that, and that is that PyTorch sort of provides this universal interface to all different kinds of hardware. So it really makes things a lot simpler for developers. It's very fast. It's a very nice API. So really every developer wants to use PyTorch. And they started out sort of at Facebook, where people, they just wanted a tool to do something, to do their work more efficiently and better. And then they saw that it would be great if the rest of the industry were also using this, because then you get to collaborate and you get to benefit from the latest advancements. And so that's why they made it open source. And then other companies, they saw, it's getting traction, and it's very useful for us to just use this and adopt it and build onto it further. And so with PyLabRobot, that's kind of the trajectory where I hope we're able to do the same thing, is to sort of become like PyTorch.
Well, the biotech and pharma industries, they are notoriously competitive. They are also notoriously secretive. I hear that a lot. And gosh, when I go to an AI machine learning meetup, there is a sense of camaraderie even among like the AI labs, which is harder to find in biotech. That may or may not be true. I don't know. This is just what I'm hearing on the interwebs and in some conversations. What do you make for the argument that, hey, if I'm fill in the blank large company, there's a real benefit and an incentive for me to keep this kind of development in-house. If I have sort of the secret sauce in terms of how to automate, my laboratory, and I can get a lot more efficient, and maybe that can help optimize my R&D spend and get me to more clinical trials faster, like I shouldn't actually share with others. Like, what would you say to that perspective?
I think there is definitely like a big sentiment of sort of secrecy and wanting to keep things to yourself in the biotech space, which to me, that's a little bit unfortunate. I think obviously when you have drugs like this IP of this single molecule, what it looks like is worth so much money. So I get where those ideas come from. But then when you look at sort of like the more basic level about how to actually get a Hamilton star robot to move sort of these basic things, everyone is already solving the same problems. Everyone is already doing the same thing. And there's not really so much secret sauce on this level. It is, how do I get a machine to move? That is going to be the same for everyone, no matter what protocols you're running. And so I think on this level, it really makes sense to be open and to collaborate and sort of have these like synergistic, collaborations where everyone benefits from every other person, building like this sort of foundational tools layer. But then above that, obviously, you have companies where the IP is also very important. But I think, again, coming back to this point is, the rest of the world is probably going to move on and collaborate on something. So do you really want to be the person where you're doing your own thing in secret by yourself? I think you probably want to collaborate with other people and benefit from their work.
Well, maybe the answer to this next question I'm going to ask is it's that company, yet unnamed, who reached out to you. But I'm curious if you have seen any large biotech, pharma companies that are really leading by example in embracing kind of the open source community and trying to solve these shared problems across industries?
To be honest, I've not seen so much from big pharma, to be honest.
Okay, well, it's still early days. Hopefully that'll change. Maybe next time we chat.
Hope so.
Maybe going under the hood a little bit of PyLabRobot. So looking at, again, your GitHub, I was looking at what kind of hardware you support, and I saw liquid handling robots, Tecan, Hamiltons, plate readers, pumps, centrifuges, heat shakers, incubators, temperature controllers. There's some work in progress runs around thermocyclers and sealers, flow cytometers, scales. You've really moved beyond just liquid handlers. Can you tell us more about sort of the journey of moving beyond liquid handlers to other kind of types of hardware that you might find in a lab, and how you have chosen to, or maybe the community has chosen to integrate with those specific hardware types?
Yeah. So to your first question, why is this useful? I think it's kind of obvious. Like if you want to automate your research, it is very annoying to have to use different systems that don't really communicate to each other, where you have one program where you work with a certain plate and you move it into a different program and you have to redefine what that plate looks like. That just gets very annoying and doesn't really scale. So from that perspective, there's so much value in having everything together, that you can schedule it together and you can make all the software sort of talk and have the same references. So it's a very natural development, I would say. If you want to become this interface to lab automation, you have to support different kinds of machines if you want to do something useful. So some machines are very useful on their own, but for the bigger workflows, you really need to have different machines working together. And then in the sense of how we sort of choose which devices are going to be integrated is. I guess there's not really an answer to that question, because there's not like this single central planning like behind what we do. We're not like intending to write like an automation software. We are trying to, for example, Retro, we are trying to develop like longevity therapeutics. And so that is our job as a company. That's how we are going to make money. And so PyLabRobot is more of a means to an end, and also for the contributors that is the case. So whatever device you need for a current protocol to make it work, that is how they get integrated. And then it's the same for the contributors. Which machine do I need right now to get my work done? And then if there's not really a good interface, maybe they choose to contribute that to PyLabRobot.
I love that saying, right? It's a means to an end. These devices, getting them to work more effectively, that's not, where that secret molecule is that, right? That's going to help with cancer, Alzheimer's, or longevity. I'm curious, is there anything that you think is as you have seen PyLabRobot be developed and maybe contributed to it handling other types of devices outside of liquid handlers, I don't know, is there anything that's been surprising or fun or particularly challenging in working with, a flow cytometer versus a heater shaker versus, other types of devices?
Yeah, so every device kind of speaks its own language. So when you think about these machines, in the end, there's a USB cable that comes from the machine that goes into your computer, and there are some data, some bytes that are flowing over this cable. And those bytes, they're sort of structured in a specific language. Just like you and I, we communicate in English right now. We could maybe communicate in some other language. It's the same for devices. They communicate in a specific language over the USB cable. And so there's a lot of differences, even between machines of the same kind, how they represent their data and how it is sent over the cable. For some of them, it's easier. For some of them, it's more difficult to figure out what's going on.
Is the easiness or difficulty generally correlated with like the brand of the company or the type of device? What have you seen?
I would say it is correlated with the type of with the company, just because they employ specific people who like to do things in specific ways. Not necessarily to think about people writing their own interfaces, more so that it's just how they like to work, which languages they write their software in, for example. And then I would say it's really correlated with the type of machine. You can imagine for a skill, there is a single command, get the weight, and then there's a single number, which is the weight. And maybe there's like a zero function or a tare function, but they are simple machines, so it's simple to figure out what the language is. And then for liquid handling robot, which is this very big general machine, it's going to be a little bit more difficult, but that's only weakly correlated. For some machines, the language is incredibly complicated. For example, for a centrifuge, the language was one of the most difficult ones that we have seen, even though it only spins at a specific speed and like opens and closes the door. Yeah.
Wow. So could you maybe give us, put us in your shoes. You've got a new device, or just the community is trying to integrate a new device into PyLabRobot. You mentioned there's data flowing over a USB cable. What does I don't know if reverse engineering is the right term, but what does the process look like of integrating one of these devices into the PyLabRobot sort of ecosystem?
So just like how there's a bunch of variants in devices, I would say there's a bunch of variants in how you integrate a device. If that weren't the case, I would have written an algorithm to sort of automatically implement all of them. And unfortunately, that's not possible. For integrating a device, there's sort of different ways that you go about it. In some cases, there's documentation available on what the language looks like. So this is like the firmware command set, for example, and how does a machine talk over the USB cable, which is sort of like the easiest example, which on the one hand I enjoy because it's fast for me to add a new device. On the other hand, I do like to solve puzzles. So for other devices, there is essentially no documentation whatsoever. Maybe within the companies, like one or two people know about the protocol. And so really there you just use this program to observe or kind of like sniff the bytes that are flowing over the cable. And then you get a bunch of bytes on your computer. And then my job is to analyze, just stare at the bytes. How is the data that I sent represented? And there are some general strategies here. So for example, I always like to send a single command to the machine that's very simple. For example, open the door. And then I look at the commands that I have captured. And then I send another command, for example, close the door. And then I see maybe 1 or 2 bytes different between those two captures that I made. And so I know probably one of these bytes is going to be the command for open the door. One of them is going to be for close the door. And so you have an hypothesis. And imitating the scientists at my company, I then have a hypothesis, I'm going to test it. So I'm going to send this byte myself. and then see if the machine does what I expect it to do, which often is the case. Sometimes you need a little bit extra, but that is mostly the process. And then from there, once you know those commands, maybe you can say, lock the plate down or move the plate to a specific location. And then what's that going to look like? And then you can sort of, it's kind of like a Sudoku puzzle where you sort of start with like maybe the simple commands, and then once you have that filled in, you can recognize those commands in bigger captures and figure out like what is the missing piece here, and sort of go from there.
That is so fun. I'm curious, when you talk about, see what bytes come in, are we looking at, zeros and ones, binary? Like what physically or visually are you looking at when you say bytes?
You could use the ones and zeros. I think mostly people like to look at hexadecimal characters, which is a little bit more concise notation. That is sort of like the most basic level that people look at. Sometimes these bytes, they decode to actually text. But that is not always the case, but sometimes you can use one of these different standard encodings between bytes and text characters. For example, ASCII is one of the most famous ones, where, for example, a byte, 32 is going to decode to a 2. And so sometimes you're able to decode your entire byte stream into just text, and then maybe you can recognize some numbers from there. At other times, the data is directly encoded. For example, an integer, which is a natural number, can be encoded into bytes more efficiently as well. In which case, more efficient typically means it's a little bit more complex on the other side.
So in one of our exchanges before, recording today and talking, I was curious about and excited about the ability to use these large language models and essentially these kind of coding copilots as assistants to help with this reverse engineering process, or translation process or integration process, whatever the right word is. And you mentioned, I think one of the challenges specifically is the role of the tokenizer and how tokenizers are used and how they are can get in the way of the process that you just described. So could you maybe share more about sort of, what the current state and the potential state is of these coding copilots and helping these kinds of integration problems?
For sure. Yeah. So first of all, I do really love to use these tools. Like for Github Copilot is one of my favorites, and more recently OpenAI Codex. These tools, they're fantastic for writing code. For the process of reverse engineering specifically, I found them to be a little bit less useful because, like I just mentioned, there are these different byte streams that you sort of capture from the machine, and then you're trying to make sense of them. And for this, I found large language models, they're not so good at figuring out what is the pattern in these bytes. And one hypothesis for this is actually that it's because of the tokenizer. So maybe to just use an example that maybe people might be familiar with is, you can ask large language models this question: how many R's are there in the word strawberry? And oftentimes it will tell you 2, even though that's like the most, like a 3-year-old can answer that there are 3 R's in strawberry. And the reason for this is that when computers to read like these words, they don't go S-T-R-A-W, they sort of go maybe S-T-R-A-W in one unit of text, and maybe berry is another unit of text. Or just however the tokenizer learned that is the most efficient way to represent data. So this is sort of getting into the technicalities where if you represent more characters using 1 byte or sort of 1 vector in the large language model, you can have text generated more efficiently. So for the companies, they love to use tokenizers as much as they can. But then since you're not looking at the individual characters, it's getting more difficult to actually understand in terms of the text that the user gives you, what specifically are the patterns in here. So you can imagine if you cannot count the words R and strawberry, how are you ever going to figure out in this byte capture, what is the pattern to these bytes? But maybe in the future, I think people are working on sort of more like byte level encoders as the sort of compute resource grows. There's going to be more compute, so you can sort of use a little bit less efficient things. You can afford to do that. And so hopefully that's going to get better for reverse engineering and interpreting in that side. For now, I'm glad that I still have a job in looking at these bytes. But yeah, once you have figured out like the pattern in these bytes, and for example, this byte that's like number 17 or something corresponds to the open of a specific machine. Once you have this information in a text file, and I give it to chat, and then I also give like this other backend in PyLabRobot to chat, it is able to like pretty much write me a new backend. So it does save a lot of time sort of on the other side of interpreting the byte streams.
Fascinating. So, we talked about the real value of being able to essentially democratize, access and interoperability among all of these, amazing devices that are being built by the Tcans and the Hamiltons and the Opentrons and so forth of the world. What's been their reaction to the work that this large and growing community of folks at PyLabRobot have been doing?
And so officially, I don't think they have a reaction to it, but unofficially, they definitely have expressed interest and sort of appreciation, and particularly from the people working at those companies. Sometimes you get these LinkedIn messages saying, not speaking as this employee, but just between you and me, I think that you're doing cool work. So that really is great to hear. I hope in the future that these companies will maybe see more value in actually collaborating and seeing that if you trust your hardware to be good, it's actually a good idea if other people use the same interface for your hardware and someone else's hardware. Because nowadays, actually to give you a specific example, once upon a time, someone that I know was giving away a TCAN because their lab was kind of shutting down, so they had no longer a use for this machine, and then I wanted to give this to another person that I knew who was just starting out their lab. But then this person said, I already have some Hamiltons, so if I got a TCAN, there would be like vastly different software, and so I would not really be able to use them. Like, it's a free liquid handling robot, which is like tens of thousands of dollars, but then you're unable to accept it because it's just so difficult and such a pain for you to use this. And so I think between the companies, if you're interested in stealing each other's customers or sort of making your machines more useful, I think there's actually a lot of value in sort of supporting these more open communication standards. And that is in addition to the way that we actually make the devices themselves more powerful by having sort of lower level control over them.
What would you say to, so again, from just anecdotally, what I hear is that folks get really certified and trained up on specifically like Hamilton brand devices and TCAN brand devices and so forth. And maybe they've been doing that for 10 or 20 years. Maybe they are, again, have a job and great income as a result of being a specialist for that specific brand. Like, what would be, I guess, the opportunity or message for them to embrace something like PyLabRobot?
I think that generally over time, tools, they get nicer and people get more productive. So I think that's sort of one of the wonderful things about the world is people, they like to have good tools and they like to make better tools. And so I really encourage people to just try it out and see what is going on and see how you like it. And hopefully we can enable people to do their job better and faster. I think a lot of those people, the fact that you require such specialized knowledge means that you're not really able to use chat, for example, to help you with your work. And so if you were able to use chat, it could be 10 times or 100 times more productive. And so I think it's going to be a great opportunity for people to do what they're already doing, but do it maybe a lot faster and in more scalable ways.
My sort of optimistic maybe hope is that as access and the ability to use these kinds of machines is more democratized, you might have more like startups and other organizations without the funds of the large biotech companies that feel that they can actually contribute in some way, which then will create more demand for these kinds of machines. So then ultimately will increase sales. So maybe you might lose a little bit of revenue in sort of kind of having a lockdown ecosystem, but actually gain it in sort of growing the pie of folks who are buying these kinds of devices.
And definitely. I think the value is of a machine. Like, the market is not really stupid. Like, the market pays for what provides value. So if you can provide more value, I think in the end you're going to make more money. And the way that you can provide more value is to allow people to really use the machine to their fullest extent instead of being kind of like locked down by this OEM software which determines what you're able to do. So with PyLabRobot, we found that some people there just only use Hamilton Star, for example, and they're able to do such like amazing things that they might not be able to with just the default OEM software. And so to them, a star suddenly becomes so much more valuable. And so they're probably hopefully going to pay more money for it in the future. And also, if more people use the machine, there's just a greater volume.
Are there, I think when I have seen, I'm trying to remember, I don't know, I used to tinker with my car a lot, right? And you see things like, well, if you tinker with this, right, it's going to be out of warranty, and maybe this is beyond spec, so this thing might overheat or blow up or something like that, and could damage sort of the machine. So how do you, I guess, has that come up where when folks use PyLabRobot, it actually causes like physical damage to the machine, and how do you manage that and keep these machines running?
Yeah, so some people that are definitely kind of concerned about this aspect. I'm not entirely sure if using PyLabRobot is going to void your warranty or not. I don't think that it would, but definitely like confirm with the manufacturer if you're concerned about warranty. What is the status of this for them? For us and for I think most contributors, they really care so much about getting things done that it's worth it to them to just kind of take the leap of faith and trust themselves to use the machines correctly. With PyLabRobot, we do send sort of low-level commands, so you kind of miss out on the safety features that the OEM built into the software that they provide. But on the other hand, we are definitely not trying to enable the people to break their machines. Like, we also care about safety. It should be difficult to break your device if you're using PyLabRobot. That is how we design it to be the case. We want the people to have a good experience using it. And so we're also building these features in. At the same time, with PyLabRobot, we are also trying to give power to people. So with all of these safety features, if you want to, and it's going to be very explicit, you're able to use the machines in ways where there's maybe more unpredictability. But I will say, in all my years of working on this, I've only ever broken a machine once, which was not during reverse engineering. It was during this operation where I was just not paying attention. It could have easily been avoided.
Amazing. So in a paper that you had shared with me about PyLabRobot, I think one of the recurring themes that I saw, which got me excited, was around essentially scientists being able to share protocols across different types of labs with diverse different types of equipment, and being able to execute those protocols kind of more effectively. I think there was a link there to reproducibility, which I know is a large issue in science, where you have these amazing experiments that might be published in very prestigious journals, but then when other scientists try to recreate them, they aren't able to get some of those results. Maybe speaking back to your high school biology class that you described there. So could you maybe share more about sort of what that vision might look like and how it links to reproducibility?
Yeah. So definitely reproducibility, as I described earlier, was one of the key inspirations for me to even start thinking about Python for sort of describing biological protocols in the first place. So that is really a great inspiration. I think it's a little bit sad if you look at the state of biology today, where really the state-of-the-art way to communicate, if I have done an experiment to you, is me just telling you in English. There's like this whole tech transfer idea where we go together to the lab for like many days, and I show you specifically like how every finicky detail works, which is not really like a productive way of working together, in my opinion. If you look at computer programmers, if I had to collaborate with someone and I had to tell them write the code in this specific way, and maybe add a comment there and change this if statement into some other if statement, or change the while loop into a for loop, that's going to be very difficult to collaborate. Ideally, I'm just able to share some code that they can run, and everything just kind of works. And so how do we get sort of more towards this? The computers are like sort of the ideal scenario where you can just share code. So how do we get towards that for biology? I think one way is just to have a good representation of your protocols, where English it's very imprecise, and code is going to be very specific. So how do we get from one to the other? I think automation is kind of the answer there, where you can have code execute some experiments. And then together with that is, obviously people are going to have different devices from different manufacturers, which is great because they have all the different strength, and there's the competition, so it makes things better. And so it's important for this library that it is universal. So for example, if someone has a heater shaker or an incubator from one company, and someone else has the incubator and a heater shaker from a different company, if you share the code, it should still work. And so with PyLabRobot, really we try to have like this universal language where for the bunch of machines actually do the same thing. An incubator just stores plates at a specific temperature. So it only makes sense to have the same interface for all these different machines. So ideally in the future, people can just share a protocol and have a run on their setup no matter which machines they're using. And sort of the ideal vision that maybe is more of a dream, but I hope in the future that when people publish their paper online, that there's going to be a PyLabRobot script next to it of here's how to execute my experiment, and another scientist seeing this and downloading the code and forking it. Where forking is this concept of computer science where you take someone's code and you adapt it and make a change, and then either contribute it back or continue developing it on your own. And I think that is going to be a huge boost for collaboration and reproducibility.
Wow. Really digitizing the scientific method and the scientific process, and allowing people to, as you mentioned, share it much more easily than having to, physically show up and look over your shoulder for a couple of days.
Definitely.
Yeah. So we've been talking a lot about life science. There's also automation in material science and the chemicals industry and so forth. Have you seen any interesting kind of adaptations of PyLabRobot to, again, outside of biotech and pharma?
I think PyLabRobot is mostly been focused on life sciences and people using it for those purposes. I'm not entirely sure. I've not really looked so much into the other fields, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Have there been any interesting, unexpected collaborations in sort of the work that you've been doing so far?
Definitely meet a lot of very interesting people doing very interesting things with their robots, which surprised me and I think even surprised the manufacturers sometimes. My favorite example of this is made by Camillo, who I mentioned earlier. In the famous PR69 to PyLabRobot, he turned the star with this liquid handling robot into a coordinate measurement machine, which is this sort of 3D scanning robot. And the way that he did this originally was to use a pipette tip and then use a liquid level sensing capability to just move a pipette tip down until it senses some capacitive force, and then it knows where that is in Z height. And then you already know where on X and Y your pipette channel is. And so you can actually create very detailed scans of your objects that you just put on a liquid handler deck, which I don't think Hamilton considered that when they were building a liquid handling robot. And then recently has upgraded this feature to not actually even require capacity or this object set can sort of transmit electricity there because he uses the pipette channel to move it down on the Z-axis very slowly. And then until it sort of crashes into an object very gently, but then it does sort of crash, and then you can actually at that exact moment send a request to the machine, hey, at which Z height is your channel right now? And so it works for any kind of object, even like plastic objects right now, which is just this like amazing application of this technology that I think even Hamilton did not expect. Which sounds very hacky, and I definitely love it for that reason, but actually it's also very useful. Is that he was able to make this feature because nowadays when we need to sort of calibrate maybe some different kinds of lab or know exactly what they look like, you no longer have to get out your caliper. You can just actually use a star to make the map for you, and so there's also a practical benefit.
That is such a fun example. It's also the kind of thing that I imagine that if you are in high school or even mid or later career and you want to play with these kinds of machines, like what I'm hearing is somebody in a sense made this machine their own, right? They found a use case that was totally outside of what it was sold for, but it probably was something that got them excited to learn more, then to share with others that kind of lit up their minds, and I think that creates sort of a positive feedback loop, right, for supporting projects like yours.
I hope so. Yes, it's definitely one of the cool things about this project, in my opinion, is that you really have ultimate flexibility and freedom to do whatever you want. Everything about PyLabRobot down to the lowest levels is open source, and then the dependencies are also open source. So no matter where you want to tinker, you have the ability to go in to the code, modify, change it, read it, just use it however you like, essentially, and adapt it to these crazy ideas that people have. And so I think that's a huge benefit over giving people freedom is, people have crazy ideas, so you should be able to express them. And I think with PyLabRobot that is one of the goals is to give people really the freedom to experiment with these kinds of very weird, hacky ideas that they might have.
That's awesome. So, as I have seen, and on a recent podcast episode, I took a tour of the Lawrence Berkeley A Lab, which is an autonomous lab for material science discovery. There's a lot of investment and interest in self-driving or autonomous labs, sometimes called closed-loop labs, where you can have some model generate a hypothesis and then actually have robotics test that hypothesis. In the material space, it might be mixing a bunch of different powders together, looking at that material under an X-ray, an XRD machine, and then updating that model and kind of continuing that loop, both as a way of exploring new materials, but also maybe even creating new data and experimental data that can help these models get better as well. There's also, I think even like national strategic tailwinds here around onshoring and being able to do more research that's currently being done by contract research organizations, for example, abroad, being able to do that more domestically. So when you look at that kind of just large theme of self-driving labs and onshoring, like where is there overlap with PyLabRobot and the work that you're doing?
I hope that PyLabRobot is kind of an enabling technology for some of these things. So when you think about self-driving labs, there is some kind of computer program that needs to be able to control some hardware. That is sort of most abstractly what is going on. And so it is important that the software can talk to the machines. This is kind of a trivial next thought. And so it's important that there's like nice APIs and nice tools for developers. Where I think if you look outside of PyLabRobot, most of the ways that you control these machines is using these kind of complicated GUI interfaces, like these different apps that people use. And so that is maybe kind of difficult. But with PyLabRobot, there's just like a Python API, Python program. And Python is a super widely used programming language. So there's so much stuff that people have already written in it. And PyLabRobot just is another library. So you can just import it and use it with other tools just exactly as you like it. And so it just kind of connects or makes available these machines to the general computing ecosystem, which I hope that is kind of maybe a driving foundation for some of these self-driving lab technologies, is to make it easier. Actually, one example of this that I worked on personally during my thesis project is for optimizing liquid transfers. That is sort of like a common task for people to do that is they aspirate, meaning suck up some kind of liquid, and then they dispense it elsewhere. And so for very small volumes of liquid, say like 1 microliter, how do you get that accurate and precise? So you, for example, use like kind of a flow rate that is kind of low. You need to go to a specific height in the liquid and maybe move up the pipette slowly. So it is kind of this optimization problem that is difficult because there's some inherent stochasticity, like there's some kind of randomness in this process, and it's kind of high dimensional, and you cannot, it's not a function, so you cannot compute a derivative and do gradient descent. You really need to think about kind of optimization of this. And so I was able to use some artificial intelligence and some like Bayesian optimization like libraries that are already written in Python and just apply them to lab automation. I had like this liquid handler and I had the skill set up, so I could just do the transfer using the parameters that I got from a model. I take the weight using the skill, and then I update the parameters and see, does my transfer get more accurate and more precise? And so I was able to write this sort of closed loop system where I guess it's sort of like a narrow example. It's very commonly done in lab automation, but I hope that can sort of maybe be like one example of like the self-driving lab. And then in terms of onshoring, I think just it's important for people to kind of do research quickly, and so and at high throughput. And so I think automation can definitely be a very interesting alternative to manual people doing the work. Also, I think it's more humane to have robots doing this kind of repetitive work than maybe people. So whether you use like some of the OEM software, or PyLabRobot, or maybe some other tool, I think that's going to be an interesting thing for many people.
There are some companies when I was just doing some background here, there are companies like Unite Labs, Ganymede, Synthase that have platforms that seem to in a way compete with PyLabRobot. There's also organizations like Sila, I think, that are trying to set standards across sort of like lab automation. What do you make of efforts like those?
I think it's great that people are working on automation more and more. I would not necessarily say that they're like competitors. With PyLabRobot, our job again is not to write automation software. We're focused on delivering results and getting things done. And PyLabRobot there is just the way that we do that, because we don't really see that there's other ways that we are able to do those things today. And so in that sense, we're just trying to develop this library for our own needs. In addition to that, I think if you look at some of those companies, like before PyLabRobot started 3 years ago, there's, I guess, a little bit less of these companies. And so since we have made open source a lot of these device drivers and people can kind of look how to talk to the machines, and you start to see more of these companies sort of pop up, and maybe the first generation of these companies already, kind of moving on. I think it's great to see, like I'm very grateful that PyLabRobot can inspire so much of these different projects. And in some cases, you actually look at like their APIs and, you can really see that they take inspiration, and so that makes me very proud.
So let's say we reconnect here in a year, 3 years, 5 years, and I'm asking you, I said, Rick, what's the latest in PyLabRobot? What's the current state of PyLabRobot? Like, what kind of conversations do you think we're going to have? Like, how do you see PyLabRobot evolving over this time period?
I hope that as we have more documentation for PyLabRobot and more sort of usage examples available online, that in the next years, the LMs are going to be able to read how to do lab automation and kind of maybe start to write their own protocols. I think that is very exciting if we could get, like, for example, ChatGPT to generate some protocols for people in PyLabRobot, and just seeing more devices integrated and more people being productive with it.
Stepping back, big picture, I'm curious, what's one big idea or question that you're excited about or thinking a lot about right now?
I've been working on automating flow cytometry, which is not really a big question, like, what's the meaning of life? But I guess it does take maybe multiple months, which to me that's a big project, because most of the development in PyLabRobot is like hours or days. So I guess that is like the big project, so to speak, these days.
So, I was looking into flow cytometers recently. I've never handled one myself, but as I understand it, essentially you have, it looks like a tube, or you have maybe different types of cells that are going through it, kind of shot through it maybe one by one. You've got a laser on the side that I think is shining against those. And through that, you're able to see, for example, like the shapes of different cells and so forth. Am I getting this right?
Yes. So it's kind of like a microfluidic device where the cells, they flow through the specific very small channel one by one. And then, as you point out, there's a laser, some different filters, and then you can see the different scatters of the light through the material. And so you can actually learn a lot about the cell without having to, like sequence. So it is kind of like high throughput, kind of cheap. A lot of scientists really like to use it.
And you talked about the different devices and how they all communicate through those USB cables. Some of them might just be, a centrifuge and incredibly complicated for some reason, and others are a lot simpler. Where do flow cytometers fit on that spectrum?
This one was a little bit difficult, to be honest. The way that the data is represented to you is more difficult than what you might expect. So maybe just to get into the weeds here a little bit, is for this machine, whenever you're reading flow cytometry, whenever you're running flow, as the scientists call it, when there are cells flowing through the machine, what it does is it continuously reads data from the machine, where I expect that the data gets back is just the current data, like that is sent after the last time that you requested new data to be sent. But as it turns out, it also includes the data that was read before. And so you kind of have to figure out which data have I already seen and which data is new, and sort of deduplicate the pattern from there. So that was an interesting thing to discover.
Wow. Always surprises, right, as you look and peer under how these machines are coded and built.
I love staring at the bytes and solving those puzzles.
That's awesome. Cool. Well, you've got a great community that you've built already. I'm curious, for folks who listen to this podcast and are inspired, whether they're, just starting off as engineers, or maybe they're in one of these large companies, how can they be helpful and contribute?
So we have specifically actually tools for people where they do not have robots themselves, which is fundamentally different from having to buy a device and getting the CD drive with it. So you can just go to GitHub today, and maybe there's a link in the video description where you can go to GitHub, download the code. It's all for free, just very easy to install, and then kind of use like the simulation capabilities and the visualizer to sort of see, what is PyLabRobot's model of what is going on the deck. So that is definitely an easy way to start. And then maybe if you have some automation machines yourself, it could be nice to see, like, does it initialize with PyLabRobot, does it connect, and then see if you like it. In addition to that, we also run a forum, so where there's like the community that we come together and discuss PyLabRobot.org. We just have chats about PyLabRobot and app automation and figuring out different devices.
Well, I love that. I think another example of just democratizing access. You don't have to be as lucky as your friend who was gifted that liquid handler or device that you've mentioned in order to be able to play. You can actually, in a simulated environment, kind of see the workings of how you might use PyLabRobot to control devices.
Yes.
Yeah, that's really cool. Great. Well, I think with that, for folks who might want to get in touch with you specifically, or the PyLabRobot community, I'm going to have a link to the GitHub. But what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
You can just go on the forum and send me a personal message there. I think that's probably the easiest way to do it.
Okay, great. Well, Rick, from a cold email in Boston to this journey that you've been on in really creating both a really useful technology, but a community of folks who are trying to democratize lab automation. I'm just really grateful to have the opportunity to have heard your story and of the work that you're doing, and I'm really excited to see how it continues to take shape.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been an amazing journey, and I look forward to the future.
Awesome. Thanks, Rick.
Thanks.
Well, thanks for joining us on this episode of Discovery Engines. As Rick mentioned, we're going to put some links to the work that we've been discussing in this video. If you want more updates and also just other resources about what's happening in AI for science and lab automation, check out our newsletter at discoveryengines.co. See you next time.